It was just past 3:10 on a cold September morning when the mist settled over the Dutch lowlands like a thin shroud. The moon was faint behind drifting clouds, casting only enough light to reveal the broken outline of a hedgerow and the shattered roof of a farmhouse struck earlier by artillery. Somewhere in the darkness, boots pressed carefully into wet soil, moving without rhythm, without formation, the steps of men who were never meant to be here. A British airborne patrol, scattered by flak and blown miles off their intended drop zone, crouched in silence as distant German engines growled along the road they were supposed to secure. Their radio was dead, their officer missing, their maps smeared with mud. The only certainty was uncertainty itself. At the center of this small, breathless group stood a single paratrooper, a man who was neither the highest in rank nor the most experienced, yet whose calm presence anchored the others to the ground beneath their feet. In the minutes that followed, every decision he made would determine whether they vanished into the night or carved their place into history, and understanding how they reached this moment begins long before the mist settled on that fragile field. By the autumn of 1944, the war in Europe had entered a phase defined by momentum and desperation. The Allies, having broken through Normandy's deadly hedgerows and pushed across France with astonishing speed, now aimed to force a rapid end to the conflict before winter set in. German forces, battered yet still capable of fierce resistance, clung to every river line and fortified town scattered across the Low Countries. It was in this unstable landscape, a mix of optimism, exhaustion, and brutal attrition, that airborne forces once again stepped into the center of Allied strategy. Britain's paratroopers, heirs to the lessons of Berneval, Sicily, and Normandy, were viewed as the sharp edge of a doctrine that valued surprise, initiative, and aggressive action deep behind enemy lines. Their battlefield was confusion, their strength the ability to fight as independent fragments when plans inevitably shattered upon contact with reality. The evolution of Britain's airborne arm had been rapid and unforgiving. Training was designed to strip away hesitation and replace it with calculated instinct. Men were taught to navigate by moonlight, read terrain under fire, and operate as cohesive units even when scattered across miles of hostile countryside. Their equipment, lightweight Sten guns, compact explosives, distinctive red berets, symbolized mobility and audacity. But these outward markers masked the relentless discipline demanded of every paratrooper. Once delivered by aircraft or glider, they were expected to fight immediately, often without supply lines, often without clear intelligence, and always with the knowledge that reinforcement might never arrive. In such an environment, the ethos of self-reliance became a survival trait rather than a slogan. The operation that placed the Lost Patrol into the Dutch mist was intended to demonstrate the full potential of airborne warfare. It sought to seize critical crossings, disrupt German movements, and open a corridor straight into the industrial heart of the Reich. Intelligence assessments predicted scattered but weakening German resistance. Reality would prove harsher. As transport aircraft crossed the coast, enemy radar detected them, and flak batteries opened fire with practiced precision. Some sticks landed miles off target, their planned rendezvous points lost in a patchwork of fields, canals, and isolated farmhouses. In the first chaotic hour, any sense of a cohesive airborne front dissolved into clusters of small groups trying to orient themselves before dawn. It was within this chaos that the seeds of the Lost Patrol's ordeal were planted. A company assigned to secure a road junction found itself fragmented by low cloud cover and erratic winds. One aircraft released its paratroopers late, scattering them in a long broken line across unfamiliar ground. Another had taken damage from flak and released its men too early. Communications, already fragile, degraded further as radios hit the ground or batteries failed. Men who had trained together now found themselves emerging from the darkness alone or in pairs, calling softly for familiar voices, assembling improvised groups under anyone who could provide direction. Among these fragments was the patrol that would later be remembered. They were meant to be part of a reconnaissance element pushing toward a key crossroads that German units used to move reinforcements. Instead, they landed nearly 3 kilometers east of their intended zone, in territory that German forces had reoccupied only days earlier. Their expected guiding landmarks, a rail embankment, a windmill, a canal bend, were either out of sight or deceptively similar to others in the region. What began as a temporary disorientation soon grew into a deeper uncertainty as they realized they could not locate the rest of their battalion. Yet the situation, dire as it was, did not immediately break them. Training took over. They formed a perimeter, checked ammunition, whispered through their last known bearings. The silence of the countryside was unnerving, broken only by the distant rumble of vehicles and an occasional flare rising far to the west. Their officer had not been seen since the jump. A corporal attempted to re-establish radio contact, tapping and adjusting the useless set with growing frustration. Among them stood the paratrooper who would soon become the linchpin of their survival, quiet, attentive, absorbing the confusion without letting it cloud his judgment. Their predicament reflected a truth long understood in airborne operations. No matter how detailed the plan, the battlefield belonged to uncertainty. And as the first hint of dawn softened the darkness around them, the patrol understood they were no longer executing a mission as assigned. They were now shaping their own path through a landscape where every hedge, every lane, every distant engine presented a decision with consequences none of them could yet imagine. That silent realization was the beginning of the journey that would lead them toward their defining moment, and toward the man who would guide them through it. The patrol that emerged from the scattered remnants of the drop was an improvised body of men bound together more by circumstance than by structure. There were 10 of them at first, though none could say with certainty who else from their platoon might be wandering the fields beyond the hedgerows. Some were veterans who had jumped in Sicily or fought through Normandy's bocage. Others were new to combat, carrying the weight of their first mission along with their equipment. They carried what they had landed with, Sten guns slung awkwardly over webbing, a single Bren gun providing their heaviest firepower, a PE slung across one man's back as an ungainly reassurance against the threat of armor. Their pockets held a careful ration of ammunition, a bit of chocolate, a crumpled map, and the unspoken question of how far they truly were from the rest of their battalion. Their intended task had been straightforward on paper. They were to land near the designated drop zone, assemble quickly, and push toward a critical road that cut east toward the German defensive line. Their role was reconnaissance, locate enemy positions, identify reinforcements moving toward the bridges, and report back. It was a mission requiring stealth, initiative, and discipline. Traits the British airborne proudly cultivated. But the moment their boots hit the ground, the plan unraveled. The flak that had rocked their aircraft had forced the pilot to drop early. The wind scattered them further. The terrain, broken by canals and narrow dikes, made orientation difficult even in daylight. When the officer failed to appear and the radio remained stubbornly silent, the men realized that they could not rely on command to reshape their situation. They would have to shape it themselves. The terrain around them was deceptively tranquil. Flat fields stretched into the dim morning, punctuated by drainage ditches, willow-lined lanes, and isolated farm buildings with brick walls scarred by previous fighting. The air was cool and damp, carrying the scent of turned earth and distant smoke. But beneath the calm surface lay the constant threat of discovery. German patrols routinely moved along the narrow farm roads, often accompanied by dogs or supported by light armored vehicles. Civilians, wary of reprisals, stayed indoors, their windows shuttered even as the first signs of dawn crept across the horizon. Every sound, a distant engine, the bark of a dog, the clatter of equipment, carried with it the weight of possible danger. It was within this uneasy landscape that the paratrooper at the center of the story began to emerge as a figure of steady influence. He was not the highest in rank. A corporal and a lance corporal still technically held more authority. But leadership in such situations does not always follow the clean lines of a pre-mission roster. It grows instead from presence, clarity, and the ability to see what others overlook. He carried himself with a calm that did not mask the gravity of their situation but made it bearable. When the corporal hesitated over which direction to move, it was this paratrooper who quietly suggested they orient themselves using the canal to the south. When a nervous private fumbled with his Sten gun, it was he who helped him check the magazine with a reassuring nod. Small actions, barely noticeable in the moment, but unmistakable in their effect. As the morning brightened into muted gray, the patrol finally began to move. Their objective, if it could still be called that, was simple enough: find friendly forces, regroup, and re-establish some connection to the larger battle unfolding around them. They advanced slowly, choosing cover over speed, observing every line of sight before crossing open ground. Twice they halted as German voices drifted across the fields, the men sinking silently into the grass until the threat passed. Each halt reminded them of how isolated they truly were. No artillery supported them. No neighboring platoon anchored their flank. They were alone in a fluid, shifting front where the enemy moved freely and their own side existed more as a hope than a certainty. As hours passed, the gaps in their group became more apparent. One man twisted his ankle crossing a ditch and had to be supported. Another, shaken by the intensity of the drop, struggled to maintain his composure. Rations were limited, water more so, and the weight of equipment grew heavier with each cautious mile. Yet through it all, the same paratrooper continued to anchor the group's resolve. His voice rarely rose above a whisper, but whenever he spoke, suggesting a route, identifying cover, urging patience, the others listened. It was not authority in the formal sense. It was earned trust, created by competence and steadiness in a world that had suddenly lost its structure. By midday, they reached a small rise overlooking a narrow road where German vehicles occasionally passed. From here, they could see miles of open terrain, yet no trace of their own battalion. The realization settled over them slowly but unmistakably. They were no longer a reconnaissance element feeding information into a vast airborne machine. They were a lone patrol behind enemy lines, shaping their own survival through every choice they made, and those choices would soon place them on a path that would turn their quiet leader into something far larger than any of them could have foreseen. In the story of the Lost Patrol, the first and most unshakable angle is the human one, the quiet, relentless pressure that settles on men who suddenly find themselves cut off from the world they know. For the paratrooper who would become the center of their survival, that pressure arrived not with a dramatic gesture but with a series of small, unavoidable moments. Each choice he made carried weight: where to place a sentry, when to halt, how to calm a shaken comrade. Fear was present in every man, heavy as the equipment on their backs, but his steadiness created a narrow path through it. He had no formal command, no written authority, yet his presence shaped the patrol's rhythm. Where others saw only the open, threatening landscape, he recognized patterns in the fields and hedgerows, subtle shifts that might offer concealment or danger. That quiet clarity became the human core of the story, the transformation of an ordinary soldier into the figure others depended on simply because the alternative was uncertainty itself. Yet the human angle could not be separated from the tactical one, for survival behind enemy lines was a matter of correct decisions made under strain. The patrol's world shrank to a series of distances: the width of a ditch, the length of a hedgerow, the 100 yards between one patch of cover and the next. Every movement had to be calculated with the precision of a battlefield map, except the only maps they had were incomplete and smeared by damp soil. The paratrooper understood instinctively how to use the terrain. He placed his men where they could observe without being silhouetted, directed them to crawl rather than walk when the ground rose too sharply, and ensured the Bren gun was always carried by someone who could bring it to bear quickly. His tactical competence did not manifest in grand maneuvers but in the quiet refinement of small decisions that allowed the patrol to move unseen and remain one step ahead of chance encounters that could have destroyed them. But tactics alone could not sustain a group of men in such isolation. Morale, often an invisible force, became a critical angle of their struggle. The psychological strain of being lost in enemy territory tightened with each hour. Hunger sharpened tempers. Exhaustion made simple tasks feel monumental. The silence between the men grew heavier as they realized their isolation was not temporary but indefinite. In those moments, the paratrooper's influence expanded beyond tactics. He found ways to keep their minds from unraveling: a quiet word of encouragement, a reminder of their training, a shared cigarette during a brief halt in the shadow of a ruined barn. Even his way of distributing responsibilities mattered: rotating who carried the Bren, who scouted ahead, who guarded the rear. These simple acts restored a sense of order, giving each man the reassurance that their fate was not governed solely by the chaos of the battlefield. For the patrol, The tension between survival and purpose created a new kind of clarity. Though technically a reconnaissance element, their mission had transformed entirely. They were no longer mapping enemy lines. They were navigating a shifting psychological landscape where every sound, every flicker of movement, held both threat and opportunity. The paratrooper recognized that the men needed not only direction but meaning, a reason to keep moving despite mounting fatigue. He framed their progress in small, achievable goals: reaching a distant farmhouse, crossing a canal before dusk, avoiding a German patrol that had been heard but not seen. These incremental victories gave the men the sense that they were not merely wandering but moving toward something, even if that something was nothing more than the faint hope of reuniting with friendly forces. Through these overlapping angles, the human weight of responsibility, the tactical precision of small unit movement, and the fragile cohesion of morale, the patrol began to function not as a group of lost soldiers but as an organism shaped by necessity. Their leader emerged not by declaration but by the quiet accumulation of trust, reinforced with every decision that allowed them to continue forward. And as their situation grew more complex and the threats around them multiplied, these angles would deepen, revealing further layers of technology, enemy intentions, and the moral calculus that lay ahead. Each perspective moved them closer to the moment when their improvisation would harden into legend, shaped as much by the forces they managed to avoid as by the battles they would inevitably face. Beyond the human and tactical dimensions, the patrol's survival hinged on the fragile edge of technology, the limited tools they carried into the darkness, and the unforgiving constraints of wartime equipment. Their one remaining radio had already failed, leaving them without the ability to report their position or receive updated orders. This silence was more than an inconvenience. It severed them from the wider airborne effort, transforming what should have been coordinated maneuvers into blind navigation. Their weapons, though reliable in close combat, had distinct limitations. The Sten gun, light and compact, was notoriously sensitive to dirt and required deliberate handling. The Bren gun offered dependable firepower, but its weight slowed the man who carried it, forcing the patrol to adjust their pace. The P, heavy and awkward, was their only answer to armored threats, yet its short range meant it was a weapon of necessity rather than advantage. The paratrooper understood these constraints intuitively. He treated ammunition as a lifeline and resisted every impulse to fire unless absolutely necessary. Technology could empower them, but misuse could doom them, and this understanding quietly influenced every movement the patrol made. Yet technology was only one side of the equation. On the other lay the enemy, a force far more organized, numerous, and familiar with the terrain than the isolated airborne patrol creeping through their fields. German units in the region had been on high alert since the first reports of parachutes descending across the countryside. They operated with disciplined coordination, sending out reconnaissance teams supported by armored cars and light infantry. Their networks of informants, roadblocks, and patrol routes created an invisible web of danger that the British paratroopers had to navigate with constant vigilance. To the Germans, spotting even a single paratrooper was a signal of greater threats nearby. Reports of small groups moving east of the canal or gunfire heard near the farmhouse ridge triggered rapid responses. For the patrol, this meant they were always minutes away from being surrounded, always at risk of misjudging an approach or crossing open ground at the wrong moment. The paratrooper leading them anticipated these patterns, often choosing longer, more concealed routes that kept them in the shadows while German forces swept through the surrounding roads. Amid these tactical and technological challenges, a deeper moral tension settled over the group, an angle far less visible yet profoundly influential. The patrol was trapped between conflicting obligations: survive long enough to rejoin their unit, or take action against the enemy whenever an opportunity presented itself. Each choice carried consequences. Engaging German troops might slow reinforcements heading toward the primary battlefront, but it could also reveal their position, triggering a pursuit from which escape would be nearly impossible. Conversely, avoiding contact meant preserving their strength but risking being overlooked when their comrades needed every possible advantage. As the hours passed and the situation grew more uncertain, these moral decisions weighed more heavily. The paratrooper understood that courage was not merely the willingness to fight but the ability to distinguish between necessary action and reckless sacrifice. He evaluated every potential ambush, every observation of enemy movement, through the lens of cost and impact. The men could sense this deliberation, not hesitation, but measured judgment, and it reassured them more than any rousing speech could have. The terrain itself amplified these moral dilemmas. A lone German motorcycle courier speeding along a road might be an easy target, but attacking him would invite reprisals that could trap the patrol in a tightening ring. A group of infantry resting in a farmyard might present a tempting moment of disruption, yet the presence of a single radio truck could turn a brief skirmish into a flood of enemy troops converging on their position. The paratrooper weighed each option with a clarity rooted in both instinct and training, balancing the responsibility he felt toward his men with the responsibilities he still bore toward the broader operation. In these moments, the patrol's fate rested not on battlefield heroics but on the quiet, internal battles fought within the mind of the man they followed. Through the lens of technology, enemy intention, and moral calculus, the patrol's journey takes on greater depth. They were not simply lost soldiers improvising their way through hostile territory, they were a small moving point within a vast and complex conflict, where every decision rippled outward in unseen ways. And as their situation evolved, the interplay of these angles would push them toward the moment that would define their legacy, the instant when necessity, opportunity, and resolve converged to force a decisive action, one that would elevate their quiet leader from an unassuming paratrooper to the central figure of a story carried far beyond the fields they crossed. That moment, when it arrived, would transform the fragile balance they had maintained into a single, explosive turning point. By the time dusk settled across the Dutch countryside, the patrol had been moving for nearly an entire day, guided by instinct more than certainty. The fields, so open and exposed beneath the midday sun, now darkened into long stretches of shadow broken only by the faint glimmer of canals and the silhouettes of distant barns. It was during this fragile transition from daylight to night that the patrol reached the rise overlooking a narrow country road, a place they had passed earlier without concern. Now, as they paused to rest, they noticed something different. The wind carried the low hum of engines, steady and rhythmic, approaching from the east. The paratrooper motioned for silence, lowering himself into the grass, listening with the focused stillness of a man who understood the significance of sound before sight. Within moments, vague shapes began materializing along the road, the outlines of trucks, a staff car, and what appeared to be a radio vehicle fitted with a tall antenna swaying slightly as it moved. This was no simple supply convoy. From their vantage point, the patrol recognized the composition, a small but organized German column, likely moving to reinforce positions closer to the contested bridges. The presence of the radio truck meant that the unit was not merely on the move but actively coordinating with higher command. That single vehicle had the potential to direct enemy forces across a wide sector, forces that could crush the fragile airborne lodgment forming miles away. The patrol, hidden in the waning light, now faced a decision that carried implications far beyond their own survival. If they allowed the convoy to pass untouched, German defenses would harden further. If they attacked, they would disrupt enemy coordination but expose themselves to swift and overwhelming retaliation. The paratrooper weighed these truths silently, feeling the eyes of his men settle on him once again. Part of him knew that striking the convoy violated the unwritten rule they had been following all day: avoid detection, survive until reunited with friendly forces. Yet another part, shaped by training and sharpened by instinct, recognized the rare opportunity before them. A small, well-placed ambush could inflict disproportionate damage, perhaps delaying enemy reinforcements by precious hours. He scanned the terrain, a shallow ditch running parallel to the road, a cluster of willows offering concealment for the Bren team, a narrow choke point where the road curved sharply around a rise. It was not ideal ground, but it was enough. Quietly, efficiently, the patrol prepared. The Bren gunner positioned himself where he could fire into the middle of the column, maximizing confusion. The PAT team crawled toward a low verge, the cumbersome weapon held at an awkward angle that promised both power and risk. Sten gunners found their places along the ditch, spacing themselves to avoid bunching. Every movement was deliberate, subdued, and executed without the spoken coordination of a formal platoon. The paratrooper walked the line once, touching a shoulder here, adjusting a field of fire there. No grand speech, no raised voice, only the calm certainty that had carried them through the day. When he reached the edge of the ditch and saw the lead vehicle coming into clear view, he knew the moment had arrived. The ambush began with a single, decisive act, the crack of the piece firing into the growing dark. The weapon's spring-loaded mechanism recoiled harshly into the operator's shoulder as the projectile arced toward the lead truck, striking it in a burst of flame and splintered metal. The sudden explosion ripped through the stillness, freezing the column in confusion. A heartbeat later, the Bren opened fire, its rhythmic bursts raking the length of the road. German voices rose sharply, some shouting orders, others scrambling for cover that did not exist. Tracer rounds sliced through the air, illuminating the chaos in brief, violent flashes. The paratrooper moved among his men, firing short, controlled bursts from his sten, shifting his position to keep the enemy guessing. He felt the familiar blend of clarity and urgency settle into his mind, the world narrowing to arcs of fire, muzzle flashes, and the shifting silhouettes of German soldiers trying to regroup. The ambush was working. The radio truck, caught in the crossfire, attempted to reverse, only to slide into a ditch as a Bren burst shattered its windshield. Its antenna toppled, twisting as it struck the earth, a small detail, yet symbolically enormous. But with success came danger. The Germans reacted with the practiced discipline of seasoned troops. A machine gun mounted on one of the trucks began to bark into the darkness, its rounds whipping across the fields and kicking up bursts of soil near the ditch. The patrol ducked low as the air vibrated with lethal energy. A flare shot into the sky, bathing the scene in harsh white light that erased every shadow the men had relied upon. In that instant, the paratrooper knew their advantage was slipping. They had struck a powerful blow, but the enemy was mobilizing, and staying would mean annihilation. He called for withdrawal, a single word, urgent but steady, and the men responded instantly. The discipline they had maintained throughout the day now paid dividends. They fell back in pairs, covering one another as they slipped into the deeper shadows beyond the rise. The paratrooper remained near the rear, firing occasional bursts to slow the German advance. Only when the last of his men had disappeared into the darkness did he finally turn, sprinting toward the safety of the field beyond the hedgerow. The convoy behind him was burning, shouting, organizing, a disrupted force now fully aware of their presence. Yet the ambush had done its work. In the space of minutes, a small lost patrol had struck at a vital artery of enemy communication, delaying movements and sowing confusion precisely where the wider battle needed it most. But their act had also awakened the German sector. The quiet anonymity that had shielded them all day was gone. As the patrol regrouped in the darkness, listening to the growing clatter of enemy vehicles converging on the road, they understood that the next phase of their struggle would be even harder, a relentless pursuit that would force them toward a confrontation none could yet foresee. The night pressed heavily around them as they withdrew from the burning convoy, their breaths sharp in the cold air, their bodies driven more by instinct than strength. The fields that had felt vast earlier now seemed to close in, shaped by the unseen presence of enemy forces responding to the explosion and gunfire. German flares rose intermittently behind them, casting long, skeletal shadows across the ditches and hedgerows. The patrol kept moving, guided by the paratrooper who had become their quiet compass. He did not rush them. Speed without direction was a trap. Instead, he led them in deliberate arcs, avoiding roads, slipping through orchards and along canal banks where the water muffled their steps. Every so often, they heard the distant growl of an armored car or the clipped shouts of German infantry sweeping the area. The net was tightening. What had begun as a stealthy withdrawal was slowly turning into a chase. By midnight, exhaustion had settled over the patrol like another layer of gear. Their muscles burned with every step, and the adrenaline from the ambush had long faded. They found brief shelter in the ruins of a small brick farmhouse half collapsed by shellfire. Inside, the darkness was thick and heavy with dust. The men sank against the walls, drinking what little water remained and dividing a single tin of rations that someone pulled from his pocket. As they rested, they heard vehicles on the road beyond the fields, the engines stopping and starting, doors slamming, voices carrying through the night. The Germans were spreading out, forming search lines that would soon sweep through every patch of cover. The patrol had disrupted something important, and the enemy intended to respond with force. It was here, in the cold hollow of that ruined farmhouse, that the paratrooper made his most consequential decision. Staying put until dawn would result in discovery. Moving blindly risked stumbling into an enemy position. But retreat alone was not enough. He understood that the Germans would anticipate a straightforward escape attempt to the west, toward the assumed location of British forces. Instead, he proposed something counterintuitive: move east first, deeper into enemy territory, using the confusion of the search to slip around the tightening cordon. Once the patrol broke free from the immediate dragnet, they could angle back toward the larger airborne units with a chance of reaching safety. The plan was risky, but the alternatives were worse. The men listened, weighed his reasoning, and agreed. Trust by now was instinctive. They left the farmhouse moments before a German patrol approached it. From a distance, the men could hear boots crunching on broken tiles, the low murmur of searching soldiers, the scrape of rifle barrels against door frames. But by then, the patrol was already moving along the canal, their silhouettes blending with the dark water beneath the banks. Their new route took them through a belt of woods, dense enough to provide cover but tangled with undergrowth that slowed their progress. Branches snapped softly underfoot, the smell of damp earth clung to their clothes. The paratrooper led from the front, pausing often to listen, truly listen, for the faintest sign of danger. When he stopped, the men froze. When he moved, they followed. Every minute felt borrowed. Eventually, the woods thinned, giving way to a narrow rise overlooking a field cut by a single dirt track. On the far side stood a low, abandoned barn, its roof sagging, its walls riddled with bullet holes. It was not a sanctuary, but it offered concealment and a vantage point for assessing their next steps. They reached it quietly, slipping through a gap in the wooden boards. The interior smelled of old hay and rot. Yet before they could settle, movement flickered at the edge of the field. A German patrol, 5, perhaps 6 men, was making its way along the track, their lanterns swinging gently, their rifles slung but ready. The proximity of the threat tightened every nerve in the barn. One accidental sound could end everything. But fate had its own designs. A loose plank shifted beneath one soldier's boot, the faintest creak in the stillness. The German lantern paused. A voice called out in warning. Within seconds, the patrol outside split into 2 elements, one advancing toward the barn, the other spreading out to flank it. The British patrol knew what came next. To remain inside meant being cornered. To flee meant stepping into open ground under hostile fire. It was the paratrooper who broke the tension, signaling quietly for them to prepare. The confrontation had found them, and now it had to be met. The barn erupted into violence with the sudden, tearing sound of the Bren gun firing through a gap in the boards. German shouts rose in alarm as the patrol outside scrambled for cover. Muzzle flashes lit the field, rounds punched through the barn's thin walls, showering the interior with splinters. The paratrooper moved with deliberate precision, directing fire, shifting his position to prevent the enemy from marking it, calling out targets with steady confidence. Under his coordination, the patrol laid down a controlled, disciplined defense, not a frantic struggle, but a measured stand that bought them precious seconds. Seconds were all they needed. During a brief lull in the firing, the paratrooper signaled for a breakout through the rear of the barn where the wall had partially collapsed. Smoke and dust clung to the air as the men slipped out one by one, crouching low, sprinting toward the cover of a shallow gully beyond the field. The paratrooper remained until the last man had cleared the barn, firing short bursts to keep the enemy pinned. Only then did he follow, darting across the open ground as bullets snapped through the air around him. When he dove into the gully beside his men, breathless but alive, the relief was palpable. The German patrol regrouped behind them, but the British were already slipping deeper into the darkness, using the terrain to break contact. They would not stop for a long while, not until the sounds of pursuit faded, not until the night swallowed the echoes of the barn fight. That battle, brief and desperate, sealed their fate as more than just a lost patrol. It was the moment when resolve hardened into legend, when survival demanded not just endurance but the kind of leadership that emerges only under fire. And as dawn approached once more, the consequences of their stand began to ripple outward, setting the stage for the story the world would come to remember. When dawn finally broke, it revealed a landscape still trembling from the chaos of the night before. Smoke lingered across the fields they had crossed, rising faintly from the distant convoy they had ambushed hours earlier. German forces continued to sweep the area, their shouts and vehicle engines echoing between farmhouses and canal banks. But the patrol was no longer there. Under cover of darkness, bloodied and exhausted, they had continued pushing west and north, navigating by memory and instinct rather than by map or compass. The barn fight had cost them dearly. 2 men had been wounded, one with a deep graze along the ribs, another limping from shrapnel embedded in his leg. Yet despite these injuries, no one had been left behind. The patrol moved as a single organism, straining under exhaustion but held together by a shared will to survive. As they advanced, the broader consequences of their actions began to take shape in ways invisible to them at the time. The destruction of the radio vehicle had severed a temporary but critical link in the German communication chain. Reports that should have reached battalion and regimental headquarters were delayed or lost entirely. Orders to redeploy troops toward key defensive points around the bridges were postponed as officers struggled to confirm whether the attacks were isolated incidents or indicators of a larger British presence. The ambush forced German units to divert resources toward hunting the supposed larger force that had struck the convoy, drawing manpower away from positions where they were urgently needed. For the British airborne troops fighting to hold their tenuous foothold, that delay, measured not in hours but in the breathing room it created, proved invaluable. Yet the patrol did not know any of this. Their world had shrunk to the immediate concerns of movement, concealment, and survival. By midday, they reached the outskirts of a small hamlet where the ruins of a church tower offered both a landmark and a temporary vantage point. From there, they could see distant columns of smoke rising from the main battleground, a reminder of the larger fight unfolding beyond their isolated struggle. They paused only long enough to catch their breath and rewrap wounds. Their rations were nearly gone, their canteens nearly dry. But the paratrooper who had become their leader kept them focused with quiet, steady reminders. Avoid the roads, move in shadows, trust the ground beneath your boots. His voice, even in fatigue, seemed to steady the air around him. In the early afternoon, as they skirted a stretch of woodland, they encountered signs of recent fighting, spent shell casings, discarded equipment, and the stillness of earth that had been churned by explosions. The sight reinforced the reality that they were moving through a battlefield in motion, one where front lines shifted hour by hour. They knew that at any moment they could stumble into either friendly forces or another German patrol. Every decision remained a gamble, every path a risk. Yet the paratroopers' choices continued to guide them with uncanny accuracy, weaving between enemy movements and toward the faint possibility of safety. By late afternoon, the patrol finally heard what they had been straining to detect for more than a day, the distant, unmistakable sound of British small arms fire, short, controlled bursts that carried the familiar rhythm of their own training. It was not close, nor was it entirely clear, but it was enough to signal that they were approaching the outer fringe of friendly positions. Relief mingled with caution. The enemy still patrolled aggressively, and approaching British lines too openly risked being mistaken for infiltrators. Step by step, they advanced with renewed determination, every man aware that they were nearing the end of their ordeal, though none yet understood the weight their actions had quietly added to the larger battle. Their survival was no longer simply a matter of endurance. It had become part of the shifting momentum of the operation itself. And as the sun dipped toward the horizon, marking nearly 40 hours since their chaotic descent into the fields below, the patrol found themselves on the threshold of the larger story that would one day define them. What remained was the final stretch, the part of the aftermath in which their deeds would not only shape military outcomes but etch themselves into the memory of those who documented the war. They reached friendly lines just after dusk, emerging from the tree-line as a ragged cluster of silhouettes moving cautiously across open ground. British sentries challenged them at rifle point, tense and alert, until the paratrooper stepped forward and answered with the quiet confidence of a man who had been holding himself together for far too long. Relief washed through the patrol as they crossed into the safety of their own perimeter, not a triumphant return, but a subdued, exhausted arrival marked by handshakes, murmured congratulations, and the immediate attentions of medics who ushered the wounded toward improvised aid stations. For the first time in nearly 2 days, the men allowed themselves to sit without fear, their bodies trembling not from cold but from the release of unrelenting strain. News of their reappearance spread quickly through the airborne units. Lost patrols were common in such operations, but few returned with stories of ambushing a German communications column or fighting their way out of an encirclement. Officers listened intently as the paratrooper recounted their movements, their engagements, and the terrain they had crossed. His report was methodical, free of embellishment, delivered with the same steady tone he had maintained since the moment they touched the ground. The details he provided helped clarify gaps in the battalion's understanding of enemy dispositions, offering fresh intelligence at a time when every scrap of information mattered. What had felt, to the men living it, like a desperate attempt simply to stay alive, now revealed itself as a series of actions with tangible tactical value. Word of the destroyed radio vehicle drew particular attention. Signals officers recognized immediately the significance of that loss to German command and control. Even a brief disruption in communication could ripple outward, affecting unit coordination and slowing reinforcements at critical choke points. In the broader context of the battle, where British airborne forces were fighting to maintain their foothold against determined enemy counterattacks, such delays could mean the difference between a held position and a forced withdrawal. The patrol had not only survived, they had shaped the battle in ways far beyond their understanding at the time. In the days that followed, the men were folded back into their units, some returning to duty, others evacuated due to their injuries. But their story began to spread, passed from platoon to platoon with the quiet reverence reserved for feats that combine courage, discipline, and sheer endurance. There was no single moment when it became a legend, rather, it accumulated its significance in the retelling, gaining weight as officers referenced it in briefings and comrades recounted it around makeshift cook fires. The paratrooper at the center of it all remained characteristically reserved. When asked about his decisions, he attributed them to training, necessity, and the collective resolve of the men beside him. Yet those who had followed him knew differently. His calm leadership had been the thread holding them together through every hour of danger. Official recognition came slowly, as it often does. Reports were compiled, statements collected, and recommendations drafted. Some spoke of awards, others suggested commendations or mentions in dispatches. But beyond the formalities of military paperwork, the story took root in the memory of the regiment itself. New recruits would one day hear of the lost patrol that fought its way back from the far side of the lines, guided by a paratrooper who had shown what leadership under fire could truly look like. Veterans would recount it in scattered gatherings after the war, their voices softening as they remembered not only the combat but the quiet determination that had carried them through. Like many wartime stories, much of the legend formed not from dramatic flourishes but from the stark authenticity of the events themselves. Men pushed to their limits, danger closing in on every side, and a leader emerging not by rank but by necessity and character. And as the battle continued around them, with its shifting fronts and mounting casualties, the tale of the lost patrol stood as a reminder of how a small group, acting with courage at the edge of survival, could influence a struggle far larger than themselves. Their part in the battle was complete, but the meaning of their actions was only beginning to unfold. It is in that unfolding, in the space between lived experience and remembered history, that the contours of legend take shape. In the quiet years that followed the war, when the fields of Holland returned to the rhythms of farming and the scars of battle faded beneath grass and soil, the story of the lost patrol settled into its rightful place within the broader tapestry of the conflict. It was not the tale of a grand offensive or a decisive strategic breakthrough. It was, instead, a smaller, more intimate chapter, the kind of story that reminds us how wars are shaped not only by sweeping maneuvers and commanding generals, but by the choices of ordinary men thrust into extraordinary circumstances. The paratrooper who guided his patrol through darkness and danger never sought to define himself by those hours. Yet in the restraint of his actions, in the clarity of his decisions, and in the quiet strength he offered to those around him, he represented something universal about human resilience under fire. What remains most striking about their journey is not the ambush itself, nor even the last-stand fight in the sagging barn, but the unbroken continuity of purpose that carried them through each moment of uncertainty. They were men operating without the structure that usually anchors soldiers in battle: no radio contact, no senior officers, no clear knowledge of the wider situation. Yet they held themselves to the discipline and values instilled in them long before they dropped into the Dutch night. Their endurance becomes, in reflection, a testament to the power of training, cohesion, and trust. It is also a reminder of the thin line separating survival from loss, and how leadership can emerge in the quiet gestures and calm decisions that never appear in official histories. Today, when we revisit stories like theirs, we do so not to glorify conflict but to understand its human depth. The Lost Patrol's journey underscores how courage often manifests not in sweeping heroics but in the steady persistence to take one more step, make one more decision, and shoulder one more responsibility when others falter. Their passage through those perilous hours reveals a truth that resonates far beyond the fields they crossed, that even in the most uncertain moments of war, the actions of a few can echo across the generations, shaping how we remember not just battles, but the people who endured them.